Today, we're diving into a world that might surprise you, how corporations influence scientific research.
Oh, yeah.
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 We've got excerpts from 2 sources here to help us unpack this. Kind of. A 2015 article titled, "When Big Companies Fund Academic Research, the Truth Often Comes Last." And a 2021 academic paper, "The Science for Profit Model, How and Why Corporations Influence Science and the Use of Science in Policy and Practice."
Wow. Okay.
Get ready, because what we found here is a bit unsettling, I think.
Yeah, I was reading through this stuff, and it's almost like
Yeah.
like corporations are playing like a strategic game here, almost.
Yeah.
Carefully manipulating the research landscape
Yeah.
to
serve their interests.
to serve their own interests.
Okay.
Yeah.
So let's talk about this science for profit model. It sounds pretty intense.
Yeah.
And it lays out these kind of macro-level strategies that corporations use to influence science across different industries.
Right.
And it's not just limited to industries like you might expect, like pharmaceuticals. We're talking food and beverage, chemicals, mining, tech.
Yeah.
They're all in on this.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And the reach is far broader than many people realize.
Yeah.
I think one of the most striking aspects of this model is that it highlights like a systematic approach.
Yeah,
It's not just like isolated incidents.
Yeah.
It's really a multi-pronged effort to shape the scientific narrative.
So it's like a playbook for manipulating science.
Yeah, I guess you could call it that.
Where do they even begin with that?
Well, the foundation seems to be, controlling the flow of money, right?
Right.
Like over the past few decades, we've seen a really dramatic shift in research funding.
Yeah.
Like public funding, which is generally considered more independent,
Right.
Has been declining, while industry funding has been steadily increasing.
Right.
And by 2011,
Yeah.
industry funding already accounted for 2/3 of medical research globally.
That's a huge imbalance. It makes you wonder if researchers are like almost forced to take industry money just to keep their labs running.
Right, exactly. It's kind of like a,
Yeah.
I don't know, like a dependency
Yeah.
almost. So,
What happens then when a researcher's findings don't align with the corporation's interests?
that's where things get a little
Yeah.
tricky.
Yeah.
I mean, publication suppression is a major concern.
Right.
The sources detail, cases
Yeah.
where industry sponsors have essentially blocked the publication of research
Right.
that paints their products, in a negative light.
Yeah. So you're spending years.
Exactly. Imagine spending years on a study,
Right.
only to have it shelved because it threatens a company's bottom line.
Yeah. The article mentions a case from the 1980s
Right.
involving a researcher who found that generic thyroid drugs were just as effective as the brand name version,
Uh-huh.
and the sponsoring pharmaceutical company took legal action to try and suppress her findings.
Yeah, and that's just one example. Both sources kind of highlight,
Right.
this lack of institutional oversight to really protect researchers
Yeah.
from this kind of pressure. And it really raises questions about academic freedom and the integrity of, scientific research.
You hear these stories, and it's easy to think like, oh, that's just the pharmaceutical industry.
Right.
But the sources make it clear that this is happening across a wide range of sectors.
Yeah.
The 2021 paper identifies 8 different industries
Wow.
where this model is at play.
Okay.
Alcohol, chemicals and manufacturing, extractives, food and drink, fossil fuels, gambling, pharmaceuticals and medical technologies,
That's the law.
and tobacco.
Yeah, that's an important point. I think the science for profit model helps us see, these common threads across these different industries.
Right.
And it's not just about, suppressing negative findings, but corporations can also manipulate evidence by influencing the research design, the way studies are conducted,
Right.
and even how the findings are presented in
I know.
publications.
It's all about control, isn't it?
Yeah,
Controlling the questions,
totally.
controlling the data,
Yeah,
controlling the narrative.
exactly. The tobacco industry, for example, has a long history of funding research to counter evidence, linking smoking to cancer. They've
Yeah.
even been known to ghostwrite scientific articles,
Well,
making it seem like the research is coming from independent sources
Right.
when it's actually orchestrated by the industry.
so they create this illusion of scientific consensus.
Yeah, yeah.
When in reality, the research is like heavily biased. It's like a magic trick, kind of.
Yeah.
Misdirecting the audience's attention
Yeah. It's very
away from the real issue.
classic clever and sadly very effective.
Yeah.
And while the tobacco industry might be the most well-known example,
Yeah.
these tactics are being employed by other industries as well.
Okay. So we know corporations are influencing the research itself, but this science for profit model goes even further.
Yeah.
It describes 5 macro-level strategies that companies use to manipulate science and shape public perception.
Right.
Where should we start with these?
Well, let's delve into the first strategy, which is all about controlling the conduct and publication of,
Okay.
research.
Right.
Like setting the stage for a play where you already know the ending you want, right?
Right.
They fund research that's likely to produce favorable outcomes.
Yeah.
Essentially stacking the deck in their favor.
So they're not just influencing existing research.
Yeah.
They're shaping the research agenda from the very beginning.
Precisely. They can carefully craft research questions, design studies to favor specific outcomes, and even control which findings get published.
Wow.
The source mentions how the tobacco industry funded research exploring alternative causes of cancer. Things like stress or hormones to distract from the overwhelming evidence linking smoking to the disease.
Oh, so it's like creating a smoke screen.
Exactly.
To obscure the truth.
Right. And if research doesn't go their way,
Yeah.
they can simply bury it.
Right.
The sources mention how Philip Morris shut down a study on nicotine addiction in rats
Okay.
when the results weren't what they had hoped for.
Yeah.
Imagine how much potentially groundbreaking research has been, quietly swept under the rug.
Right.
Simply because it threatened, corporate profits.
It's a chilling thought.
Yeah.
It undermines the entire scientific process.
Yeah.
And erodes public trust in research.
And, it gets even trickier.
Oh,
Sometimes corporations will fund research that they know is risky.
Yeah.
Research that might not produce the desired results.
Right.
But they do so, under a veil of secrecy. So this way, if the findings are unfavorable, they can easily suppress them.
Right.
Without raising any red flags.
So it's like a calculated gamble.
Exactly.
Heads they win, tails no one ever knows they played.
Exactly.
Wow.
It creates a system where negative findings are systematically hidden, right?
Yeah.
So it gives a distorted view
Right.
of the scientific evidence.
So they control the funding.
Yeah.
They control the research questions.
Right.
And they even control what gets published.
Yeah.
What's the next step in this science for profit model?
Well, even if they can't completely control the research itself,
Right.
they can try to control how it's interpreted.
That makes sense. If they
Yeah.
can't bury the evidence entirely,
Right.
they can at least try to spin it in their favor.
This second macro level strategy is all about
Right.
framing the narrative,
Okay.
Even if the underlying research is sound. One tactic is to promote specific criteria for evaluating science that conveniently make it harder to accept evidence that's unfavorable to their industry.
Yeah.
They might set unrealistic thresholds for statistical significance
Yeah.
or demand levels of certainty that are impossible to achieve in, complex scientific studies.
So they create these impossibly high standards that only their own research can meet.
It's one way to do it, yeah.
Hmm.
The sources mention how the tobacco industry pushed a relative risk threshold of 2,
Okay.
essentially arguing that studies shouldn't be taken seriously unless they showed that their product at least doubled the risk of harm.
Wow.
This allowed them to dismiss, studies that showed a lower but still significant risk from secondhand smoke.
It's a clever way to shift the goalposts.
Right?
And create doubt about the validity of research that threatens their interests.
Exactly. And if that doesn't work, they can always resort to more aggressive tactics, like attacking and misrepresenting unfavorable scientific evidence.
Right.
They might cherry pick data, distort findings, or use inflammatory language to discredit research that they don't like.
The article gives the example of the Society of the Plastics Industry, which labeled a Lancet article on the dangers of vinyl chloride monomer as worthless and misleading.
Right.
It's like they're trying to shout down the evidence they don't want people to hear.
And they don't just attack the research.
Yeah.
They attack the researchers themselves.
Right.
They might try to discredit their expertise, question their motives, or even accuse them of bias or misconduct.
Yeah.
It's a way to silence dissenting voices and create fear among scientists who might be considering, speaking out against powerful industries.
It sounds like a very effective way to create a culture of self-censorship.
It can be,
in
unfortunately.
the scientific community.
Yeah. Researchers, especially like early career scientists, might be hesitant to challenge, powerful industries for fear of jeopardizing their funding or damaging their reputations.
So it's a multi-pronged attack.
Yeah.
They manipulate the research, then they try to control the interpretation, and finally, they go after the messengers themselves.
And the chilling reality is that it often works. These tactics can have a profound impact on public perception, policy decisions, and ultimately people's lives.
You've definitely given us a lot to think about.
Yeah.
So we've seen how they try to control the research itself and how it's interpreted, but I'm guessing it doesn't stop there.
You're absolutely right. Controlling the information pipeline is just the first step.
Okay.
The science for profit model goes even further, outlining strategies for influencing the reach and dissemination of scientific information.
All right. Let's dive into that next.
Think of it this way. They're creating like an echo chamber where their, preferred scientific messages are amplified, while dissenting voices are muffled or drowned out entirely.
It sounds like they're playing the game of telephone, almost.
Right.
Like whispering their version of the truth until it becomes like the accepted narrative.
That's a great analogy. And they have like a whole arsenal of tools to achieve this.
Right.
They use front groups, third-party organizations, even like seemingly independent experts to amplify their message and give it a veneer of credibility.
The source mentions Coca-Cola creating the Beverage Institute for Health and Wellness.
Right.
A seemingly independent source that they then use to promote their own views on nutrition.
It's a brilliant PR strategy. They create these, seemingly objective platforms to disseminate information that aligns with their interests.
Right.
And because these groups appear independent, people are more likely to trust the information they're putting out.
It's all about creating that illusion of impartiality, isn't it?
Right, exactly.
But if you follow the money, it usually leads back to the corporation with a vested interest.
Exactly. And they're very strategic about how they use legal means to control information as well.
Right.
They can bury unfavorable evidence under like mountains of legal paperwork, making it virtually impossible for anyone to access it.
It's like a real-life game of hide and seek almost.
Right.
But the stakes are much higher.
Much higher, yeah. And on the flip side, they're masters at getting their like preferred information out into the world.
Right.
They might sponsor educational programs, fund conferences and events, or partner with, professional organizations to ensure that their message reaches, key audiences.
Right.
The pharmaceutical industry, for example, is known for sponsoring continuing medical education programs, giving them like significant influence over what information doctors are exposed to.
It's like they're playing both sides of the field almost.
Yeah.
Suppressing information they don't like,
right,
while simultaneously promoting information that benefits them.
And they're very good at it.
Yeah.
They have vast resources and sophisticated strategies at their disposal.
Right.
But I think awareness is the first step towards, fighting back. Once you understand the tactics, you can start to see like the patterns and, question the information that you're being given.
So it sounds like this third strategy, influencing the reach of science, is all about like controlling the information pipeline.
Yeah.
They're trying to shape what we know, what we believe.
Exactly.
And ultimately how we make decisions.
And it's not just about like individual consumers being misled. Right. This kind of manipulation can have far-reaching consequences, influencing policy decisions and public health initiatives.
That brings us to the fourth macro strategy.
Right.
Influencing the use of science in policy and practice.
Okay.
This is where kind of the rubber meets the road, right?
Yeah.
Where these manipulations can have like real world impacts on regulations and public health initiatives.
Absolutely.
It feels like the stakes are getting even higher here.
Yeah, absolutely. This is where corporate influence can have the most tangible and potentially, harmful effects.
Yeah.
One tactic is to push for a risk-based approach to regulation rather than a precautionary one.
Can you break that down a bit? I'm not sure I understand like the distinction.
Sure. So with a risk-based approach, you essentially need overwhelming evidence of harm before you can like regulate a product
Okay.
or practice.
Okay.
Think of it like needing a smoking gun before taking action.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
A precautionary approach, on the other hand, allows for preventative action, even if the evidence isn't like 100% conclusive.
Oh, so it's like the difference between waiting for a fire to break out versus installing like smoke detectors and fire sprinklers,
That's a great way to put it.
just in case.
And by pushing for a risk-based approach, corporations can delay regulations.
Right.
Sometimes for years or even decades.
Wow.
The sources mention how the tobacco industry used this tactic to fight regulations on secondhand smoke,
Okay.
arguing that more research was needed to, like, prove the risks.
So delay tactics.
Right.
It buys them time
Right.
and allows them to continue profiting
Yeah, exactly.
from potentially harmful products.
Exactly. They also try to influence policy by promoting the use of business impact assessments
Right.
that prioritize, you guessed it,
Yeah.
business interests.
So it's about framing regulations as a burden on businesses
Yeah,
rather than a necessary measure to protect public health
exactly.
or the environment.
And these impact assessments often rely on, like, industry-funded research.
Oh, wow.
So the whole system becomes, like, self-serving, right? They
Right.
can point to their own studies.
Right.
To argue that regulations would be too costly or disruptive to businesses, even if those studies are,
Right.
biased or incomplete.
It sounds like a classic case of the fox guarding the henhouse.
Exactly. And another tactic they use is manipulating stakeholder consultations,
Right.
which are supposed to be about transparency
Right.
and gathering, diverse input from the public, experts, and
Right.
advocacy groups.
Right.
But in reality, these consultations often become a platform for corporations to amplify their own carefully crafted messages
Okay.
and drown out opposing viewpoints.
So they're gaming the system to make it seem like they're being transparent and inclusive.
Right.
When in reality, they're just trying to control the narrative.
It's a very clever strategy, and it often goes unnoticed.
Wow.
They're able to present themselves as, like, concerned stakeholders
Right.
while subtly pushing their agenda.
It's starting to feel like they've thought of everything.
Right.
Is there, like, any way to fight back against this level of influence?
Awareness is key,
Yeah.
The more people understand these tactics, the better equipped they'll be to see through, like, the manipulation
Right.
and demand more transparency
Right.
in policymaking.
Yeah.
We need to be, like, skeptical of information that comes directly from industries with a vested interest
Yeah.
in the outcome of, policy decisions.
So it sounds like we need to be savvy consumers of information,
Yeah.
not just blindly trusting what we hear
Right.
from industry groups or even government agencies
Right.
that might be influenced
Yeah,
by
yeah.
corporate lobbying.
We need to develop our critical thinking skills, learn to ask the right questions, and seek out, like, diverse perspectives.
Okay. So we've seen how corporations try to control the research itself, how it's interpreted, how far it reaches, and how it's used to influence policy.
Mm-hmm.
That brings us to the fifth and final strategy in this science for profit model. Manufacturing trust in industry and its scientific messaging.
Right. This strategy is really, like, the foundation for all the others.
Yeah.
It's about building a sense that corporations are, trustworthy partners in
Okay.
scientific research.
Yeah.
And that their science is, like, objective and unbiased.
It's like building a brand almost.
Yeah.
But instead of selling a product,
Yeah.
they're selling an idea.
You're right.
The idea that they can be trusted.
Exactly. And they do this in a number of ways. One tactic is through, like, generous funding to universities
Right.
and research institutions. They might provide grants, scholarships, or even funding for, like, entire departments or research facilities.
You know what they say, there's no such thing as a free lunch, right?
Right.
That level of funding must create a sense of obligation and, like, dependence.
Yeah.
The source gives the example of Novartis, a pharmaceutical company, giving a $50 million grant to UC Berkeley's Department of Plant and Microbial Biology.
Right.
And this raised a lot of concerns about potential conflicts of interest and limits on academic freedom.
It's a slippery slope, Right.
When corporations become, like, major funders of research, it can be difficult to maintain independence and objectivity. And then there's, like, the whole PR game,
Right.
where corporations try to associate themselves with, like, trusted figures
Yeah.
and organizations. They might partner with professional societies, fund health awareness campaigns, or even sponsor, like, community events.
Right.
All to create, a positive image and build public trust.
The source mentions Coca-Cola partnering with the American Dietetic Association.
Right.
That's a pretty powerful endorsement.
Exactly. They're leveraging the credibility of these organizations to boost their own image and make their, scientific messaging seem more trustworthy.
It's like they're borrowing someone else's halo effect almost.
Right. And it's very effective. People are more likely to believe information if it comes from a source they already trust.
So they're funding research. They're shaping the narrative.
Right.
And they're cozying up to trusted institutions.
Yeah. Anything else in their bag of tricks?
Well, they also engage in a lot of concealment, especially if their industry has a, less than stellar reputation.
Right.
They might use front groups, third-party organizations, and even law firms to funnel money and control messaging while keeping their own involvement,
hidden.
Hid.
Like the tobacco industry and their use of the Center for Indoor Air Research to fund research that downplayed the dangers of secondhand smoke.
Exactly. They create these layers of separation to obscure their role and make it seem like the research is coming from independent sources.
It's a web of deceit.
Yeah.
And it can be incredibly difficult to untangle.
Yeah.
So we've got these 5 macro strategies that corporations use to manipulate science and shape public perception.
Right.
It's pretty overwhelming, to be honest.
Yeah.
Is there any hope? Can we fight back
It's definitely a challenge.
against this level of influence?
It's definitely a challenge, but I think awareness is the first step. Right. The more we understand these tactics, the better equipped we'll be to see through the smoke and mirrors and demand more transparency and accountability.
So what can we do as individuals?
Yeah.
How do we become more discerning consumers of scientific information?
Well, I think first and foremost, don't just take things at face value.
Yeah.
Be skeptical.
Right.
Especially when it comes to information that could have financial or political implications.
Yeah.
Ask yourself, who's funding the research,
Yeah.
what their motives might be, and whether there might be other perspectives that aren't being represented.
So it's about being a critical thinker, not just passively
Exactly.
absorbing information.
And don't be afraid to dig a little deeper.
Okay.
Look up the authors of studies.
Yeah.
See what else they've published.
Right.
Check for any conflicts of interest. There are even websites and databases that track corporate funding of research.
It sounds like it takes some real detective work
It does.
to navigate this complex world
It
of
does.
scientific research.
But it's worth the effort.
Yeah.
After all, we're talking about issues that can have a major impact on our health, our environment, and our society as a whole.
One of the sources had this quote that really stuck with me.
Okay.
Academic freedom means industry funding must come with no strings attached.
Right.
It sounds so simple.
Yeah.
But it seems like we're a long way
are.
from that ideal.
We are, but that doesn't mean we should give up.
Right.
We need to keep pushing for more transparency, more accountability, and more independent research.
Right.
That's truly serving the public good.
So it's not just about being critical of industry-funded science.
Right.
It's also about supporting alternatives.
Absolutely. We need to advocate for increased government funding for scientific research.
Right.
Support independent research institutions and encourage a culture of transparency and ethical conduct.
Yeah.
Within the scientific community.
Okay. So we've covered a lot of ground here today. We've explored the science for profit model.
Right.
And its 5 macro-level strategies for manipulating science.
Yeah.
It's been a pretty eye-opening experience. And a bit unsettling.
Yeah, it is unsettling.
To be honest.
But knowledge is power.
Yeah.
The more we understand these tactics, the better equipped we'll be to see through them.
Right.
And demand better.
Right.
From the systems that are supposed to be serving us.
What's the one thing you hope our listener
That's a good question.
will take away from this deep dive?
I think the most important takeaway is this. Don't be afraid to question the information you encounter.
Yeah.
Even if it comes from a seemingly reputable source.
Right.
Follow the money, consider the motives, and seek out diverse perspectives.
Right.
The truth is out there.
Yeah.
But it's often obscured by a haze of corporate influence. It's up to us to be discerning, to be critical, and to be advocates for science that serves, the public good.
Beautifully put. I think that's a great note to end on. But before we do, there's one more concept from the sources
Okay.
that I wanted to touch on. They talk about this idea of
Okay.
agnotology.
Okay.
And I have to admit, I'd never heard that word before.
It's not a term you hear every day,
Right.
but it's a powerful concept.
Okay.
Agnotology refers to the deliberate production and maintenance of ignorance.
Okay.
It's not just about suppressing information, it's about actively creating doubt and confusion
Right.
so that people don't know what to believe.
It's like a more insidious form of censorship, almost.
Right.
Instead of outright banning information, you just muddy the waters.
Yeah, exactly.
So no one can see clearly.
And it's a tactic that's been used very effectively by industries
Yeah.
that are trying to protect products or practices that are,
Right.
harmful or controversial.
I'm guessing the tobacco industry comes to mind again.
Right. They were masters at creating doubt about the link between smoking and cancer.
Yeah.
They funded research that focused on other potential causes.
Right.
They attacked the credibility of scientists who spoke out against them. And they spread misinformation through a network of,
Right.
front groups and seemingly independent experts.
It's like they were waging a war on knowledge itself.
In a way, they were. And it makes me wonder, are there other industries that are using these tactics today?
I think you've hit the nail on the head. It feels like there's a lot of that going around these days, this deliberate attempt to create confusion and uncertainty.
It's definitely a trend worth paying attention to. Think about the fossil fuel industry and their efforts to downplay the urgency of climate change.
Yeah.
They've invested heavily in research that questions the scientific consensus, funded think tanks that promote climate denial, and even harassed and intimidated scientists who speak out about the risks of climate change.
It's like they're using the same playbook that the tobacco industry used for decades, but with even higher stakes.
And it's not just about environmental issues. Think about the food industry.
Right.
And their attempts to confuse consumers about the health risks of, processed foods and sugary drinks.
Yeah.
They fund research that downplays the risks, create front groups that promote misleading information, and even lobby against policies that aim to improve, public health.
It's a disturbing pattern, isn't it?
Yeah.
It makes you wonder if there's any area of science that hasn't been touched by this kind of manipulation.
It's definitely widespread, and the scary part is that it can be incredibly effective.
Right.
When people are bombarded with conflicting information, it's easy to become overwhelmed and just tune it all out.
So it's not just about silencing dissenting voices.
Right.
It's about creating a sense of apathy and confusion.
Right.
So that people just give up on trying to figure out the truth.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to be aware of these tactics and to be critical consumers of information.
Yeah.
We can't just passively absorb what we're being told.
Yeah.
We need to actively seek out diverse perspectives,
Yeah.
evaluate the evidence, and be willing to challenge the status quo.
It sounds like a tall order.
Yeah.
Where do we even begin?
Well, I think the first step is simply acknowledging that this is happening.
Right.
Too often we assume that science is objective and unbiased.
Right.
But the reality is much more complex.
Yeah.
We need to be aware of the potential for bias.
Yeah.
Particularly when it comes to research that's funded by industries with a vested interest in the outcome.
So be skeptical, follow the money.
Exactly.
And don't be afraid to ask questions.
And remember that science is a process.
Right.
Not a set of fixed truths.
Right.
New evidence emerges all the time.
Right.
And our understanding of the world is constantly evolving. It's okay to change your mind when presented with new information.
I think that's an important point.
Yeah.
We need to be open to new ideas and willing to kind of challenge our own assumptions.
It's not about being right or wrong. It's about seeking out the best available evidence.
Right.
And using it to make, informed decisions.
I completely agree. And remember, you don't have to be a scientist to engage in critical thinking.
Right.
We all have the ability to evaluate information,
Exactly.
ask questions,
Right.
and form our own conclusions.
Totally.
So this deep dive has been a real eye-opener.
Yeah.
We've gone deep into the world of corporate influence on science, explored the science for profit model, and even learned about this concept of agnotology,
Right.
the deliberate production of ignorance. It's a bit unsettling to realize how much effort goes into, manipulating scientific information. But I think you've given our listener a lot to think about.
It's definitely a lot to process, but I think it's empowering to, understand these tactics.
Yeah.
Once you see the patterns, you can start to see through the smoke and mirrors.
Any final words of wisdom for our listener before we wrap up?
Yeah, I would say stay curious, stay skeptical, and never stop questioning the information you're being given.
Yeah.
The future of science, and indeed the future of our planet, depends on it.
Well said. It's been a fascinating, albeit slightly disturbing, journey into the world of corporate influence on science.
Yeah.
A huge thanks to our expert for sharing their insights and helping us navigate this complex landscape.
You're welcome.
And to you, dear listener, we encourage you to keep asking questions, keep digging deeper, and keep fighting for a world where science is truly independent and serves the best interests of humanity. I think you've hit the nail on the head. It feels like there's a lot of that going around these days, this deliberate attempt to create confusion and uncertainty.
It's definitely a trend worth paying attention to. Think about the fossil fuel industry,
Right.
and their efforts to kind of downplay, the urgency of climate change.
Right.
They've invested heavily in research that questions the scientific consensus, funded think tanks that promote climate denial, and even harassed and intimidated scientists.
Wow.
Who speak out about the risks of climate change.
Yeah, it's like they're using the same playbook that the tobacco industry used
Exactly.
for decades, but with even higher stakes.
And it's not just about environmental issues. Think about the food industry.
Right.
And their attempts to confuse consumers about the health risks of processed foods and sugary drinks, you know?
Yeah.
They fund research that downplays the risks, create front groups that promote misleading information, and even lobby against policies that aim to, improve public health.
It's a disturbing pattern, isn't it? It makes you wonder if there's any area of science that hasn't been touched by this kind of manipulation.
It's definitely widespread. And the scary part is that it can be incredibly effective.
Yeah.
When people are bombarded with conflicting information,
Right.
it's easy to become overwhelmed and just tune it all out.
So it's not just about silencing dissenting voices. It's about creating a sense of apathy and confusion.
Right.
So that people just give up on trying to figure out the truth.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to be aware of these tactics and to be critical consumers of information.
Right.
We can't just passively absorb what we're being told. Right?
Yeah.
We need to actively seek out diverse perspectives, evaluate the evidence, and be willing to challenge the status quo.
Sounds like a tall order. Where do we even begin?
Well, I think the first step is simply acknowledging that this is happening.
Right.
Too often we assume that science is objective and unbiased.
Right.
But the reality is much more complex. You
Yeah.
know, we need to be aware of the potential for bias, particularly when it comes to research that's funded by industries with a vested interest in the outcome.
So be skeptical, follow the money,
Exactly.
and don't be afraid to ask questions.
And remember that science is a process, not a set of fixed truths.
Right.
New evidence emerges all the time, and our understanding of the world is constantly evolving. It's okay to change your mind when presented with new information.
I think that's a really important point. We need to be open to new ideas and willing to challenge our own assumptions. It's not about being right or wrong. It's about seeking out, the best available evidence and using it to make, informed decisions.
Yeah, I completely agree. And remember, you don't have to be a scientist to engage in critical thinking. We all have the ability to evaluate information, ask questions, and, form our own conclusions.
So this deep dive has been a real eye-opener. We've gone deep into the world of corporate influence on science, explored the science for profit model, and even learned about this concept of agnotology, the deliberate production of ignorance. It's a bit unsettling to realize how much effort goes into manipulating scientific information, but I think you've given our listener a lot to think about.
It's definitely a lot to process. But I think it's empowering to, understand these tactics.
Right.
Once you see the patterns, you can start to see through the smoke and mirrors.
Any final words of wisdom for our listener before we wrap up?
Yeah, stay curious, stay skeptical, and never stop questioning the information you're being given. The future of science, and indeed the future of our planet, depends on it.
Well said. It's been a fascinating, albeit slightly disturbing, journey into the world of corporate influence on science.
A huge thanks to our expert for sharing their insights and helping us navigate this complex landscape. And to you, dear listener, we encourage you to keep asking questions, keep digging deeper, and keep fighting for a world where science is truly independent and serves the best interests of humanity.